going to turn my video off. I just got
Yeah,
to go grab my
no
laptop charger
problem.
so that we don't run into that issue.
No problem. Hi, I see some folks trickling in. Thanks so much for joining us, everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Hello. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining, everybody. Happy Friday. We made it. Just gonna wait another minute or two for a few more folks to kind of join in today. Michelle and I were discussing with Landon our weekend plans, and we have a pretty quiet weekend. So I hope everyone else is sort of relaxing and taking it easy. Awesome. Thanks for joining, everybody. I see some more people coming in. Thanks so much. Okay, so I think we're just about 2 minutes past. I might just get started. A few more people might come on in, and that's okay. So I'm already recording, and we're just gonna dive in. So everyone, thank you again, as I mentioned, as everyone's for joining in today. Thank you for tuning into the webinar. My name, as everyone knows, hopefully, or if not, if you're new to some of PLEAC's webinars, my name is Hannah Holmes, pronouns she and her. I am the project coordinator with the Public Legal Education Association of Canada. Firstly, I am located here in Toronto, Ontario, and I'd like to acknowledge the land I and some others joining us today are on, and it's the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are very grateful to our speakers joining us today. We have Landon Kenny, pronouns he, him, male allies educator, and Mitchell Mervyn, pronouns they, them, workplace equity educator, both from the Sexual Assault Support Center of Waterloo Region. I will let them say a few more things about themselves in just a moment, but my usual sort of final administrative notes. The webinar is being recorded. We will be uploaded. I will be uploading the link to our YouTube, so the link will be circulated as usual to everyone afterwards. There's also going to be a very brief survey at the end of the webinar, and please take a minute to complete it when you can. It would be really helpful to all of us here to hear your feedback. Finally, please feel free to use the Q&A button or the chat function to ask any questions that you might have throughout the webinar, feedback, comments. Feel free to put them there. I will keep an eye on those and make sure that we save around 10-15 minutes of Q&A time at the end to answer those. If anything comes up that's sort of a burning question throughout, we're all going to be keeping an eye out for that just in case. So without further ado, take it away.
All right. Hi, everybody. So thank you so much, Hannah, for that really great introduction. And I'm so grateful to PLEAC for hosting this webinar. I don't have anything extra to add to my own personal introduction. I always like to throw in that I have a pet axolotl. I always feel like that steals the show. So I'll pass it over to Landon to also say hi before we start our screen share.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here. It's super nice to be able to talk to a whole bunch of people that are doing the kind of work and involved in this kind of work that we're doing. It's I'm relatively new to it, but I always enjoy meeting people who share the passions that we do. Yeah, Hannah kind of nailed the introduction for me. It's super nice to meet you all.
Thank you, folks. So I'm going to start our screen share. So bear with me in case my internet buffers for a moment. All right, everything appears to have connected. So we're going to be talking about male allyship in the workplace and just kind of what that means from an educational approach. And so before I dive into our own content more, I also want to situate ourselves with a land acknowledgement. So we are situated in the city of Kitchener, which is part of the Waterloo region. Those are colonial terms, of course, for the region that whose sovereign name is the Haldimand Treaty Land. And on the map, this can be quickly found because it is, I recognize it as looking a bit like an arm bent at the elbow, and that always helps me find it really quickly. It is shaped that way because it follows the Grand River. And I also want to point out that we are on the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Neutral peoples. And this is a painting that I always like to draw attention to make truth and reconciliation go farther than just learning the names of the land we're on. So I challenge anyone who is not familiar with the creation story of Turtle Island to look into that. As right here, we have a painting of the Great Mother of the Ojibwe on the back of the turtle that she made Turtle Island upon. It's a really beautiful story, and I always like to add, for anyone who is not enticed yet, my favorite character is the muskrat. And so I challenge everyone to find out what could possibly make a muskrat the best character in a story by looking into it. So thank you for sharing that moment with me. I invite you all to learn what lands are situated on, especially across Canada, because this is just a picture of Ontario. This website, if you plug in whos.land to your browser, the browser should do the rest. But it has an interactive map of Canada, and I believe even Australia is included on there. And it does show you the traditional territories of the lands across Turtle Island, or as we so call it, Canada. But that is, of course, just that sticker and label that we slapped on it. So working together in Turtle Island involves making sure we're all safe in this space as a workshop. And like, of course, we are all here together, at least through PLEAC. If you're here through PLEAC, then you're definitely here through that sexual harassment and the workplace prevention. If you're here otherwise, like through that OCRCC shout out that we sent to really promote this workshop, then you're also here for sexual violence prevention. You know how important both those things are to truth and reconciliation. So please make sure that, of course, in this space and using these guidelines or safe or braver space guidelines as an idea even already for your pedagogy for approach, make sure you're creating that safe space where asking questions is important and that everyone's challenged to ask questions. We can't leave identity in the shadows. Learn and use available supports, respect and listen to one another, be accountable to yourself and others. No, you can't help others to the best of your abilities if you're not there for yourself and helping yourself. Self-care isn't selfish. We got to be there for each other and ourselves. And of course, as in any type of group space, if you are sharing a personal story from your life, please refrain from sharing the personal names or identifiable names of the people in your story besides yourself. And that's because there are other avenues where that type of discussion and allegations would be best played out, not in a workshop like here. Lessons stay, lessons leave, but the stories stay, as one of my colleagues used to say. Recognize we're not always aware of what other people are going through. This is a webinar. The most you'll be seeing in terms of faces is Landon and my own, and we've seen Hannah's face too. But even just our faces aren't enough to know everything about us, which brings us back to asking questions. It'll feel uncomfortable to ask them, but it's important to do so. Even if it's just, how do I pronounce your name? Asking questions is key. Our agenda is we're going to, in a very webinar type of format, we're going to just keep going through each of these points. Please do, if you have any pressing questions, put them in the Q&A, and Hannah will be monitoring that in case there are any pressing ones, and she will raise them if they are extremely pressing. If they are general, they will be held off till the end. So the introduction we're covering and doing already. We're going to look at how do we frame a gendered issue from a male ally's perspective. We're going to look at some gender reflection activities that we use. We're going to touch on some of those more like human and emotional and theoretical components of actually doing this work and connecting with people, which has that element of an importance of providing tools and hope. And then, of course, we'll have some just additional suggestions towards the end for other learnings and resources, because, of course, while we are so proud of the work we do and we believe in all of the work we do, we are one team of people. We're one group of a couple individuals. And so the work that others do with male allyship is also worth looking into and researching and finding out about so that you can create a really holistic approach in your own work. And so now that I've touched on that agenda, I'm going to go a little bit backwards just to highlight that your facilitators, myself and Landon, we do come from two slightly different public education strategies at SASC. However, I am part of the Male Allies team. With Landon's focus on male allies education, it's important to bring male and masculine folks into the discussion of gender-based violence prevention, whether it's in the workplace or outside of it. And then my approach and strategy and area of expertise and focus is on workplace sexual harassment. So that's why I've met some of you at the PLEAC conference last year, and that's why we collaborate. And so with that, what's important about that, though, is that the Male Allies in the Workplace offering is not just one or the other. This was something that we did create together last year. We took a lot of the Male Allies education training and activities and theories and philosophies. We went through all those and compared and contrasted them with the stuff that Raise the Bar uses. And then we wanted to make sure that we were creating something that worked together, so that in the workplace setting, we were still creating some of that magic that happens in our Male Allies training that engages men and male and masculine folks to participate in sexual harassment prevention in the workplace. And so generally speaking, I would say that this work offering is best for male-dominated industries, which is often where we find the most sexual harassment in the workplace. But of course, it is an offering that is good for anybody, as it also helps folks who are not male identified. It provides them with the tools and empowerment to call out the men in their life who might not be acting as allies. And it also helps them recognize when there are allies around them so that they can get that help when they need it, instead of feeling like they're alone and that every man in their life is wearing a mask of some sort. This starts to give them the words and terms and tools and the flags to look for, not just red flags, but hopefully some green flags too. So with that, that is kind of that philosophical foundation here. We wanted to make sure it was a sexual harassment prevention training that included a lot of this Male Allies training. So it's both legal and it is also gender-based and holistically taking kind of like a psychoeducational approach with male folks. This is where we come from. In terms of our organization, I always say it like that and realize it sounds like I'm saying it from a map. SASC is amazing. I love SASC so much. What we do inspires me every day. We have wraparound services. We are a sexual assault support center or a rape crisis center, rather than a legal focused center. So we do aim to provide support to survivors of sexual assault, as well as those who are supporting them in their life. And so we do that with 24-hour support and online support. It's free stuff. We also have individual and group counseling, which is also free of charge. We're working on an individual counseling waitlist right now. So I always like to put the call out. If you have any folks in your life who have the privilege and power of having a lot of money, we would love to benefit from some of that and have some of that. And I'm sure that many of you folks feel that out there. But definitely, we need that community effort. And ultimately, we do the work if other people can give us that money. So we need it, and I need to be honest about that. Please give us the money so that we can help everybody. We have court support as well, both for the family court and legal criminal court. So we're there for everybody. We also have public education and anti-human trafficking program, and then we help people in between all of these things. We have great volunteer opportunities for anyone in the audience who might be situated in the Waterloo region. We do have the Male Allies program, and so just to read, I'm actually going to pass over to Landon actually just to present the slide on the program that he is leading. So I'm not stealing the thunder there. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, the Male Allies program is something that I am extremely grateful to work for every single day. It was founded with the understanding and that men in society, and especially when it comes to gender-based and sexual violence, have a very unique position and power when it comes to allying themselves against those. Due to the very gendered nature of gender-based and sexual violence, speaking to men not only on consent education, but prevention and creating kind of leaders in the community that can facilitate the discussions needed amongst their peers can create a really wide-reaching effect to try and help create a generation of men that are trauma-informed and educated on consent and preventing sexual violence. So we do this through multiple different programs like Male Allies Training, which we have a slide that kind of breaks down what Male Allies Training looks like. It's an 8-week program that talks to men in depth, adult men, about a lot of the conversations that we facilitate in the public education section specifically, but with a very intense focus on how we as men can help implement that learning and training. We also do a lot of work trying to combat a lot of male-dominated culture, things like sports culture, both from like university teams. We've done a lot of work with the Kawartha Sexual Assault Center to help create OHL Onside, which is a consent-based and anti-gender-based and sexual violence training that we bring towards OHL teams to try and combat the kind of culture of sexual violence there. And so that's it's basically just programming for men and boys of all walks of culture to try and combat the programming that they've been bombarded with their entire lives, and teach them that ending sexual violence is our responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lennon. An amazing description. And if anyone's been a PLEAC webinar presenter before, you know that we've got our time cut out for us. So I want to finish off that Male Allies training introduction here just at the start by highlighting that for anybody who is interested in this type of work and philosophy and this pedagogy, please reach out to our Male Allies facilitator, Jacob Prees. His email is on the slide here, and the slides will be distributed by Hannah after the workshop. So you will have that email even after the workshop if you're interested. It is his and our colleague Rod's job to basically bring this exact male allyship work and training to centers across Ontario. That is part of what we have been funded to do. And so if you are in Ontario and you're interested in that, please reach out to us. If you're not in Ontario, I still think it'd be worth sending an email out to see if there's any kind of leads or pointers that Jacob would be able to provide to you to help you on your journey there. But for anybody, even outside of Ontario, there's an online community platform being developed, and I'm super excited about that. It's essentially a social media platform for folks to focus on and discuss ways to engage men and boys. And so just to finish off, I'm sure many of you here, whether it's through OCRCC or through PLEAC, are familiar with Raise the Bar, but we're essentially the Male Allies training strategy, or part of the strategy that focuses on preventing sexual harassment in the workplace. It's very flexible. I've worked with teachers to help prevent or develop sexual harassment in the workplace prevention strategies between colleagues and between students and teachers, or maybe even as a teacher observing students doing what is ultimately sexual harassment and committing that towards each other. So it's very flexible, or it could just be straight up in a regular workplace talking to each other. I apologize, for some reason I always forget to delete the check-in slide out part of my slideshow. Because it's a webinar, we're not going to be doing a check-in, but I do invite folks to put in the chat, if you're comfortable on a recording, the lens that you're situated on and your name and pronouns and where you're from. I was watching names trickle in and I'm already trying not to blush too much thinking about some of the folks in the audience. So I'm going to be covering just this first section. What is the first challenge here? So the topic is framing a gendered issue. And then for each of these sections, I wanted to also frame it as the challenge from the educator perspective. Like, what are we trying to do here? If we were all here in a room trying to figure out how are we going to talk to all the men at this male-dominated workplace we just got called in to work at or to present at, our first question might be like, how do we frame a gendered issue to folks who are not educated in gender-based violence? And especially if it's male-dominated, because male-dominated folks or male-dominated workplaces will or have a higher risk of just having that some of the toxic stereotypes existing that definitely come from a lot of social media these days. So there's a lot of that hatred towards gender diversity going on, for example, online. And that's part of the challenge. How do we frame a gendered issue to folks who are so adverse to looking at things as a gendered issue because they think that that means that they are being disenfranchised as men? Well, you got to define things, and that can seem really easy or taken for granted for folks who are in this field. For example, defining feminism, sexual violence, and harassment in really straightforward, plain terms. This can be something that seems so obvious when we think about it, but often defining feminism is something that even as feminists in this room, we can all have diverse definitions of. So that's part of why that's part of the approach. And I will give an example of what I use and what we use, and came like the quotation that we felt was going to be the most successful. You want to also provide a gendered analysis of sexual violence and sexual harassment statistics so that the men can see with stats and know that, yes, there are times when men are hurting and experiencing harassment, but it is a gendered issue because women and gender diverse folks are experiencing it more. So having that finger, having at least one finger still on the pulse of ensuring that they understand that you do see that there are men hurting in this picture. But through, of course, this approach, do not let that take away in any way or erase the severity of how disproportionately women and gender diverse folks are experiencing it. I cannot stress that enough. Having a finger on highlighting that men hurt doesn't mean you're erasing that others are experiencing disproportionate rates of violence. But it still allows that door to be open enough for these men to feel safe to come in. So to break that down a bit, we use a bell hooks quote because I find that this one was extremely, like, it resonated extremely powerfully with me, and my teammates, when I showed it to them, it was agreeable to them as well. So of course, just from the incredible bell hooks, feminism is the struggle to end sexist oppression. And ultimately, this quote highlights that it's not about putting any type of woman above others, and it's not about putting women above men. It's about equality and ending sexual oppression, which happens to look like sexual assault and harassment. And so this is part of why I was blushing. I do know at least one of the authors from this paper was in the audience. So I'm like, I know that I told this person also that I've been using their paper in this way because it was such an inspiring paper, but now I get to prove it. So this is definitely a graph that I cannot like champion and advocate for enough. From this incredible paper that came out last year, it really illustrates, in my opinion, the fact that this is a gendered issue, while still, of course, acknowledging that there are men hurting in this picture. Part of what I also really enjoy about let me rephrase that, and thank you for letting me rephrase it. What I really enjoy about talking about sexual harassment prevention is that it allows us to point out an issue that men are more willing to admit that they have experienced. Because I'm sure many of us in this room know that with sexual assault statistics, once men become like once boys age and are like around like 10 and up, their reporting of experiencing sexual violence starts to just disappear, to the point where Statistics Canada can't even tell you exactly how many men experience sexual assault in their lifetime. It's usually like 1 in 6, 1 in 8, or 1 in 10. And that's because the self-reports get so smothered and they disappear for men with sexual assault. So that becomes something that is clearly very vulnerable. But with sexual harassment, the picture is different. Something about this seems to be safe, or make men feel safe enough to talk about it, that it gives them a form of empathy that I like to plug into here. I like to plug into that empathy by saying, the men in your life have surely talked about this to you. When you're with your buddies, I'm sure at least one of you have at some point talked to the others or mentioned that you've been hurt at work from harassment in some form. That allows them to have this access to engaging themselves and their own feelings, empathetically using that to engage others and know how others are hurting. It's not going to work on everybody, but it allows many folks an entry point there to realize, like, I do know folks who have hurt, and if only one of my friends is hurting and I'm a man, and this, does that mean that in circles of folks who are gender diverse, it's like all of them? It opens all these questions and realizations and light bulbs. So again, just before I move on, shout out to the authors of this paper. I really encourage everyone to look into it. And it was shared. I do want to also say Hannah did share it by email through PLEAC last year. Honestly, it was presented at the PLEAC conference. It was an incredible paper. And so I'm going to pass it over to Landon now, just to talk about, now that we have gotten some of those men and male-dominated groups on board with this idea that this is an issue that's existing, how do we actually get them to think about it, plug themselves into it, and deal with it?
Yeah. Oftentimes when these discussions in like intersectional feminist spaces come up around gender and gender-based violence and everything like that, there's this kind of innate understanding that like one of the big societal issues that patriarchy and hegemony presents to us that we have to combat against is that certain identities are found to be the standard or the default. And in relation to gender, that happens to be men. And so when we try and talk to men about these issues in which gender is such a critical component, it's really important that we try and unpack that so that they can come at it through a more critical lens and try and understand what's actually happening. And oftentimes we find certain gender reflection activities to be really, really beneficial in facilitating those discussions and creating the space for that learning to take place. It allows a good entryway into the discussion. So when we bring this learning to people, the approaches that we use is, one, we use group-based activities to start the reflection, the gender-based reflection. Group-based activities often just being best practice when it comes to facilitating how people should be learning these kind of important discussions. And it also creates a very open space for discussion, because a lot of people will come to this with a lot of questions, and it's important to try and emphasize that that's okay, and it's natural and important to have those questions so that these things can be discussed and covered before people walk away with like misunderstandings of what was trying to be represented. It's also really important to validate respectful efforts rather than try to say that there's like one specific way. Oftentimes when we talk to allies in this work, and when we tell people what is involved with being an ally in this work and with these responsibilities, we try and make it very clear that allies aren't experts on this thing, and it's a constant process of learning. And so it's really important to validate the fact that everyone comes with very different levels of learning to these places, that there isn't a single perfect way to be an ally, and we need to continually work and learn. And so when people come, as long as the questions and the curiosities and things that they bring forth with them are respectful, we need to try and do our best to respect that as well. It's why it's so important in a lot of these spaces to have masculine educators, so that the effort and what is being asked of people to try and have patience with these kinds of things isn't constantly being put on marginalized communities when it comes to gender discussions. So some of the activities that we run in order to facilitate this kind of learning, the first two you'll see here, the one is called the strongest man. The next one is the man box versus the lady box. We often try and do these ones in conjunction with each other because they offer a really, really great kind of narrative and a really great like visual demonstration of the different ways that masculinity has impacted men in their lives. So the strongest man activity is an activity where we ask people to think about the strongest man that they know, the strongest man in their lives. I know Mitchell often adapts this one for workplace education and workshops, and as such obviously sometimes changes it to like the strongest leader that you know, and things like that. But when we try and ask people, what makes that person admirable? What do you look up to in comparison to them? Because then if we run it after we run the man box or the lady box, we can create a very distinct comparison between this is what we're told we need to be as with men, which is what the man box is, and we'll get into that in just a slide, in a slide or two, versus this is what we actually look up to in the men in our lives. And we show them that there isn't just a single way to perform masculinity, and that masculinity doesn't have to be restrictive and toxic. We also have tools like unpacking the invisible knapsack, which is a tool that the person previously in my position, Ajay Scott, was incredible at doing, which was an activity where you walk through with the audience certain kind of identification statements to get them to kind of confront the privileges and everything that might be invisible to them in their day-to-day lives. And we also do an activity called the continuum of harm, which is where we have about 15 different scenarios depicting different forms of gender-based and sexual violence, and we ask the crowd to try and rank them in terms of severity, stating that there is no correct answer, and then we try and go through each of these and talk to people about the misconceptions and myths that they might have been subject to about those forms of violence, and how we can unpack those together and why those things are dangerous. Oh yeah, so there's the strongest man. So yeah, in a workplace setting, we'd have the activity. And yeah, so this one is just really to focus on the positive aspects of the things that we can look up to, rather than the messaging that we have been constantly bombarded with when it comes to gender roles. Yeah. And then this is the man box, and then after this we'll also have the lady box. This activity can take 30 minutes, can take an hour to run. It really depends on how you wish to facilitate it and the discussion that it promotes. But this is a really, really useful tool in forcing men to come to terms with the masculinity that they have been kind of spoon-fed their entire lives. It asks them questions like, what feelings are men supposed to have, that you can address, men aren't supposed to have feelings, or men can feel anger, right? And we can talk about kind of the unhealthy effects that might come from that. How are men supposed to be different from women, especially if you also run it in conjunction with the lady box? You can draw a very nice comparison between how we view and the messaging we give men and women, and the hierarchy that becomes apparent with that. How are men supposed to express feelings? How are men supposed to express sexuality? Other kind of generic questions like what jobs men are supposed to have, what roles they're supposed to take, to really get men to feed into the idea that like toxic masculinity is this rigid set of ideas that we try to tell men that they can be, right? That toxic masculinity comes from when we only enforce one way to be a man, whereas a healthier form of masculinity embraces the multitudes that everyone can bring to the table. Then also we use contrast of like, what do we tell people when they fit outside of this box? So Mitchell, if you want to go to like the blank slide. Yeah. So on the inside of the box, we would fill it up with a whole bunch of examples like men are supposed to be strong, they're supposed to be tall, they're supposed to be leaders, they're supposed to be dominant. On the outside of the box afterwards, we ask what people would call men who don't fit into this box. And we try and point out that typically the insults that we use against men when they aren't performing masculinity the way that they've been told they should is we compare them to either women or queer people. And we try and point out the hierarchy that language can invoke, right? That if we're using those terms insultingly, then it can be then it gives off the messaging that we believe that men are superior, and why that's dangerous and how we can examine that. Yeah. So those are just some examples of the kinds of answers that you can expect when you run these discussions yourselves. And then the act like a lady box fulfills the exact same purpose, but identifies a lot of the issues and societal pressures and expectations that we place on femininity, especially drawing attention to how are women supposed to be different from men, and the kind of negative identity that men can take away from that. The act like a lady box can also be extremely beneficial in pointing out how many contradictory things we expect of people, especially when it comes to women, right? That they're supposed to be natural, but they're supposed to be high makeup. There's a lot of expectations around being like performing femininity to like a very high level, like high femme. But at the same time, that's like trying too hard about how, and then you can somewhat analyze things like the Madonna whore complex. And pointing out those hypocrisies is a really good way to show people that there's no possible way to fulfill the expectations placed on people based on their gender or their sex. And pointing out that hypocrisy can be a really useful tool sometimes in helping people break down the notions that they've been force-fed their entire lives. Yeah. And then, yeah, these are the kinds of examples that you might be given when you use this other kind of gender box. And again, things that can be things that we know aren't true and can also be completely contradictory. So, yeah.
I could just add one point. Something that I have learned from experience with this activity is I definitely encourage anybody who uses it, like facilitators, to challenge folks when it comes to adding terms to the outside. Like when you ask the question, what are men or women called when they step outside of the box or don't follow these rules? I definitely encourage you to challenge your audience to phrase it in a way that is like appropriate or professional. Like instead of just having it as like a field day for anyone to say any hurtful slurs that they want to say, challenge your audience to put it in a way that analyzes it, like misogynistic terms or homophobia is brought in, or calling references to how the woman is acting too much like a man instead of actually using slurs, because that also challenges and engages the audience to consider this from a really respectful and consensual angle as well. But that also builds in a safety for your audience so that no queer people in your audience have to see or hear like the F slur during a workshop, because that can be very hurtful. Even as like a facilitator who does identify as queer, like it's always shocking to hear that, even if I've asked for it. So thank you for letting me interject with that.
Of course. Let's keep it moving so that we can try and keep on time here.
So yeah, with providing tools and hope, we're going to just kind of briefly, which doesn't do justice that it deserves to it, but we're going to do as much as we can to it, talk about the challenge of how do you provide the tools and hope necessary for participants to create the change beyond the workshop, or even more importantly, to feel like they can be part of that change beyond the workshop. Because in workshops, sometimes you leave and you feel like the presenter is the change. The presenter is the catalyst and agent of change, and you are just an observer. You're just a witness, witnessing this amazing person. The reality is, as presenters, we got to convince our audience that we are no more amazing than they are capable of being. And so that's part of where providing the tools and hope is crucial. We can't just leave them with the stats and let them know that things aren't perfect. We got to make sure that they have some type of way and hopeful way to feel like they can move forward. So part of how we do this is we ensure that we do provide tools that create accountability. So the tools need to have within them just that ability to self-monitor. So it's not just something like I held the door open for somebody, check mark on that box of that checklist. It has to be a tool that actually engages their own humanity, and so that they're reflecting on the human elements too. Like, was the person happy, or did you make them sad when you were helping them? Because then it wasn't trauma informed. So literally just teaching them what trauma informed means can be a tool. Communicate in a way that tells the audience that they can do this, instead of just talking about it in a way where it's it can create a frightening perspective, where it's like how, like where if we only use the example of bystander intervention and direct intervention, it can create this perception that the only way to actually intervene or to stop sexual harassment at work is by putting yourself into really uncomfortable situations and conflicts or interactions, when the reality is that there's a lot of more daily and insidious ways that we can challenge it. And so making sure that folks know that their journey doesn't end with the workshop, and that their journey can find ways for them to be an ally. That doesn't necessarily just need to be this one scary example of leaping in and intervening when someone's being yelled at. Provides them with tools that go beyond that, but also still cover that, because that's a crucial situation to end as well. I don't want to say that that situation should be ignored. That one is crucial to end. But folks need to also feel like they can contribute in other situations in case they're not ready to intervene in that one. And then embed hope with a vision of an intersectional culture of consent. Part of that involves defining, again, just providing a definition of allyship, making sure that you're giving them the tools to define things so that they can view definitions and knowledge as a tool. so that they know when they're scrolling through LinkedIn, and if they actually see this really good article posted, that article and them citing it and using it, they can do that, and that it matters. Because often audiences might be left without that empowerment. So defining things can be a tool in and of itself. Knowledge is a tool. So we just want to make sure, of course, that we let the audience know, just like Landon said earlier, that allyship is a continuous learning journey. And that part of that journey needs to include knowledge that holds ourselves accountable. So this statistic from Statistics Canada just recently showed that 69 to 73% of the instances where women was experiencing sexual violence at work with bystanders present, they didn't intervene. That statistic sucks. How I communicate that to my audience is I usually say, this number is so high that I cannot go without asking myself, have I been part of this 73%? When have I not intervened when I was seeing something going wrong? Because it's important that we also ground ourselves in that vision of wanting change, that I know that I'm part of this rape culture that is existing. I'm part of the patriarchy and white supremacist culture that is existing, and I need to challenge that. So making sure that we're part of the vision and hope that we're communicating is crucial. Because nobody wins out of the patriarchy and nobody has to suffer in silence. So just making sure that everyone knows that, like, this hurts everybody. This hurts you, it hurts your sisters, it hurts your siblings, it hurts your gender, your diverse friends, it hurts, I don't know, it hurts your uncle who finally felt strong enough to come out as trans. So it hurts us all. So with that, I'm just going to pass over to Landon for the rest of this section. Thank you.
Thank you. Oftentimes when we talk about how to challenge people who aren't familiar with this topic, or some people who might even be somewhat hostile to this topic, we talk about the fact that it's a continuum of change that we're trying to make within them as well. We're not going to take somebody who's overtly hostile to the idea of gender inequality and immediately bring them over to being like leaders and advocates against sexual and gender-based violence. But what we can do is try and help them move over one topic at a time. The priority always being on the safety of the people with whom they might be hostile towards. And so bringing up notions of how it harms them and the culture that we live in can be good tools in helping them inch towards allyship and make the changes necessary to create a bigger generational shift over time. We present things like the rape culture pyramid and explain why sexual violence is so normalized, particularly within male populations, as a tool to try and let them identify the harms that many people don't question. And it's also a very good transition into trying to get people to become active bystanders against gender-based and sexual violence, because we can very much call attention to the fact that it's challenging things on the bottom of the pyramid is one of the most important things that they can do. Because for a lot of people who have the misconceptions that sexual violence is only at the top, letting them know that being advocates against the things at the bottom also makes a drastic change and creates a safer space for survivors within that area is extremely important in helping them come to terms with what they need to start doing as allies. And to challenge that, we also try and promote the idea of a consent culture as opposed to the rape culture pyramid, and how there's steps that we can take in our lives, and learnings that we can go through and new things that we can practice. We actually use a very similar pyramid to the last one, but instead of being about variations on sexual violence, it talks about the steps that you can take to create a safer space with consent. Instead of normalizing sexual violence, it normalizes consent in a variety of different ways, so that people can, as the quote says, feel free to change their boundaries at any time according to their desires and needs. Excellent. And in that space, some people will never be allies, and it's important to challenge that, and it's important not to burn yourselves out. And we're trying to work with the people who genuinely want to make change and be allies to the people that we need to do work to keep safe. As the slide here recommends, Dr. Nadine Thornhill suggests 2 questions. Do the people involved sincerely want to be involved in this interaction, which is one of the most important questions that we can ask when trying to tell people how to be active allies? And do they want to be doing this in the way that they're doing it? Providing them tools and everything can be extremely useful, but sometimes they will come at it with dangerous misconceptions on what it means to be allies or create violence in a space where there doesn't need to be. And so these 2 questions can be really important in making sure that everyone stays safe in the spaces where you try and create this allyship. So this is the Male Allies training that we run. I was grateful enough to run it towards the end of last year. My coworker Jacob is currently running it for a I mentioned it in the chat just a little bit ago. Jacob is currently running this for the Women's House serving Bruce Gray. Male Allies training is an 8-week training session where we go in depth on male allyship, gender and identity and intersectionality, gender-based and sexual violence, consent, bystander intervention, responding to disclosures, and creating healthy communities. And we use the 8th week to get people to potentially volunteer for the Male Allies program that SASC runs. But the weeks before that is the actual educational content that we bring forward to try and create leaders in the community. Right.
So yeah, I just wanted to highlight and bookend the presentation again with if you've enjoyed what you've been hearing, and if you really think that this is engaging, and if you think that this is the kind of stuff that would really benefit and help your programming and approach to teaching grow, please reach out to our Male Allies facilitator, Jacob Rees. It's exactly his job to do that. Again, I want to highlight the funding for Jacob and Rod is to connect with folks working in Ontario and Ontario-based organizations. But I still encourage other folks from outside of Ontario to touch base with Jacob, just in case there's anything that he can do to support you. And if you are like a feminist or queer-led organization, then the doors just open even wider because of how the grant is set up. So please reach out to Jacob. As I promised, we do have other resources. There are other ones available in Ontario, and this is just Ontario, and this isn't even necessarily exhaustive. I'm sure that there are perhaps some run by maybe volunteer groups or run in more they're a program of a program of a program, and so it's hard to find on Google. But these exist already, and they exist in addition to SASC's Male Allies training. Please do check them out if this type of work interests you, or if you're already collaborating or work closely with one of these names here, then you might have some answers closer to home than you think. So with that, I am going to already move forward without reading them for time's sake. Please remember, folks, the slides will be provided to you, and so you will have all these words and names ready for you as soon as you get that PDF. I also want to highlight and shout out all of these amazing resources that are available to or within the Waterloo region. For time, I'm making myself not, but I could gush about each individual one here. Some of them are available for folks beyond the Waterloo region, and some are even available to the entire anyone working on Turtle Island. Like I know Wisdom to Action is a national based organization. So please do reach out to these folks. They have amazing products and amazing educational materials. These are our contact info. I'm not going to leave this up here for too long. Yes, we do have a lot of social media, and we'd love to see you on any one of them. And so with that, I want to give you a really, really big thank you. I think we're right on time for jumping into a Q&A section. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mitchell and Landon. That's fantastic. We do have a few questions. I know we have about 10 minutes left, so let's try to get to all of them if we can. If not, we will do our best maybe to follow up via email. But anyways, so first comment, I just want to say crushing it. Love learning about Male Allies program. Thanks for that really lovely comment. I did want to vocalize it. Second, how long has the on-site program existed? How is it being received? Your results so far? I see this as a huge challenge given the age group and the culture we've sadly heard about more again and again in recent times. Thanks so much for the incredible work you're doing, something to aspire to. Any comment?
Yeah, definitely. I'll take this one. So the onsite program has existed since 2016, if I remember correctly. It had a little bit of a lull over the course of COVID and the pandemics, and we've recently kind of revamped it, and we're trying to come at it with like a renewed fervor. It's being received well, I think. There has been a lot of talks in the past few months with like higher ups of the OHL about how to, and especially with my coworker Jacob, who's about how to basically make this more widespread, because as of right now, we've mostly been doing it with local teams. But with the teams that we have been doing it, so for example, the Kitchener Rangers, I've delivered it to like the Flint Firebirds online and the Saginaw Spirits. So I've been doing even non-local teams. Jacob and I have been trying to tackle that. It's always been received well. There's always been a lot of valuable conversation and learning that's come out of it. We've even managed to expand it into extra sessions to cover other kind of important topics with the Kitchener Rangers, because like multi-session teaching is best practice when it comes to these kinds of things. And we're trying to, in line with the Male Expansion Project, bring this to more and more people within both within our areas, but also within the Ontario Coalition of Rape Crisis Centres, to try and bring the teaching to more and more teams across Ontario. So it's been going well. Thank you for asking.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Landon. I'll just mark that one. But I also encourage everyone, if you have any follow-up questions, you have everyone's emails here. So I do encourage that conversation offline as well. Next, how do you think allies can approach people who have made it clear that they are not in support of consent culture and advocating against gender-based violence? I think this is where I get stuck and emotionally drained. Thank you for the great presentation as well.
Yeah, this is something that we actually, in my last Male Allies training session, we tackled pretty head on, because this is something that a lot of people get frustrated with, right? Again, I always want to clarify that it's more important to keep people safe and to stop harmful rhetoric from spreading than it is to interact with these people. But when you are in a space where you can safely do that, a lot of times within private conversations, things like statistics can be really beneficial, because a lot of these people find themselves being like very logically motivated, which comes back to this kind of misogynistic ideal that they associate themselves with. And so preventing statistics can be a really useful tool. If it's in front of an audience, oftentimes it's hard to approach people about this because they're doing it to platform and not to listen. Yeah, basically, in a private setting, take your time, stay safe. It is extremely emotionally draining and it's extremely slow work. If you have the energy to do it. If you don't, then I just recommend working with other people who are easier to try and create a culture of people who'd be willing to go to bat for questions like that. And in public, I very much encourage almost not interacting with these types of questions, unfortunately.
If I could just add just a quick little piece on top of that, a great answer, just from my experience working in the Partner Assault Response Program, which is where for folks who are charged with domestic violence, as I'm sure you can imagine, like it's the opposite of self-registration. So folks don't want to be there. To put it in one colleague's way of saying it, folks come into PAR kicking and screaming because it's the last place they want to be. So ultimately, the program, at least for men, is trying to teach them honestly how to be like better allies and how to be more respectful people in their lives. And so it's like the answers that I would give are very like pretty much the same as Landon's, but at the same time, I think that if like it's persistent, the best thing you can do is ultimately just be really straightforward with them and just ultimately just say like this is causing harm and this could honestly lead to some real legal problems in the future, and I'm not equipped to handle this, and I'm sorry that I'm not equipped to handle this, but I am not. And just letting them kind of have to realize and sit with that fact that whatever they're saying is apparently so like is something that is not okay here, is not appropriate, or it's perhaps so far past an appropriate point that they might need some other kind of help or individualized and customized help. And again, that can be sometimes the ugly wake-up call that some folks need, but tough love is a form of kindness. So that's just all I want to add to that. but yeah, it's draining, and stay safe. In our work, we do have that privilege of turning away from that. But thank you.
Thanks very much, Mitchell and Landon, for that answer. I just realized I skipped over one, Samantha. I see also you have your hand up. I hope it's about that question, but it's on the curious about the cats and dogs thing. How would you discuss that with participants?
Yeah, the cats and dogs one is a really, really useful segue into talking about how the media portrays weird characterizations of masculinity and femininity, and that it's not only like traits innate to humans that we try and push the gender on, but one that we can extend to things like cats are feminine and dogs are masculine. So when addressing that, it's definitely one that don't push for. But if someone brings up, because if you ask the question of like, what kind of things can men do? Or like, what kind of things can men have? And someone answers the question of like, men should own dogs. It's an interesting kind of conversation to analyze. It's also one that can segue really nicely into the dominant narrative of masculinity, and that dogs and have this whole alpha mentality that a lot of people mistakenly associate them with, and how we can kind of deconstruct that. So really the cats and dogs thing is just a tool to have other discussions about how gender stereotypes affect us. Through the lens of this one weird hyper-specific notion of masculinity and femininity.
Thank you, Landon. I don't know if Mitchell, if you wanted to add anything to that, but Samantha, I see your hand still up. If there's any follow-up questions, Samantha, while we wrap up, feel free to add it in the chat or in the Q&A as well, just to make it easier for me to read out. Mitchell, did you want to add anything in the meantime, quickly?
I guess the only additional like insight is that definitely even in my own like life, like I recognized that often when attributing a gender to like animals, which is kind of silly and it's in the first place, if I may point out, but it's whenever I see cats, it's often like they're like she, like your cat, like what's her name? Kind of like seeing a baby wearing pink. It's like that instinct is weirdly like to say like she, or like, oh, what a pretty girl. Whereas like with a dog, it's always like, what's his name? Like who's like yeah, just, and it's just, yeah, just all those things Landon said.
I think everyone's on the same page. We have a comments like, yeah, tackles the whole dog as a man's best friend, was this crazy cat lady discourse, which I think we've all seen a number of times. So thank you for that. Why are cars always she? Is true. Or objects, honestly. Anyways, that's a whole other conversation. Totally are on the same page. I think in terms of questions, that might be sort of generally the wrap up there, but we have some really wonderful comments and feedback, which is really sweet to see. So thanks everyone for putting that in. I do want to mention a few of them, at least read them out loud, at least for the recording. Thank you, Mitchell and Landon, so much. Tremendous presentation. Programs that you've created as well. Every community in Canada should be so fortunate to have an agency and people like yours. I just know that's Joel before even seeing that he wrote it's Joel. I live and work on Treaty 6 territory in the homeland of the Métis. We pay respect for the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. Much thanks again. Thank you very much for that really sincere comment. Great presentation, amazing, much needed work. And I think someone else also mentioned, Kathy, here, that I'll reach out to discuss how to get into construction, trucking, utility sectors in Ontario potentially. So hopefully that connection does make its way. Thanks, Joel. Feedback is always really sweet. Yeah, great. So, I mean, there are some really, really wonderful feedback that we're seeing. We're just a minute out from concluding. I do just want to add on my end, obviously, thank you, a huge thank you, obviously, from everyone who's joined us today, who will be watching the recording, and on behalf of myself and PLEAC, thank you so much to Landon and Mitchell, our wonderful speakers. You've both shared some really wonderful and helpful information in the presentation today. We're really grateful for you sharing your time. I'm sure everyone will walk away with some key learnings after today, absolutely, and anytime the recording is viewed as well. So I'm really grateful for that. I think everyone else is as well. It's not an easy topic as well, so I appreciate that. And if anyone here is interested in connecting with any of our speakers today, or colleagues that were mentioned a little bit in the presentation as well, feel free to either send me me an email, I can connect you, or Mitchell Landon really kindly added some contact information in the slides. I'll send those around as well. And the recording, just as a reminder, I will send that around afterwards as well. It will be posted on the website if you're ever curious to check it out again. And any sort of helpful links, I'll circulate that as well, as usual. So I'll let everyone go. I know everyone's rushing to other meetings or wrapping up hopefully their day early maybe today, which would be nice. But as we take a break in programming for March, we're going to pick up again in April with a few more webinars, and then some more information on sort of the conference in the fall. We'll come around again if anyone is curious, so keep an eye out on that. But that's it. I'll wrap up there. Thank you again, Mitchell, Landon, appreciate it, and we'll all be in touch. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone. Bye.